Genesis 22, an Exegetical and Biblical-Theological Commentary. Introduction. The narrative of Genesis 22, traditionally known as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, must be understood within the overarching and progressive unfolding of the divine promise plan. Following the catastrophic cosmic rebellions, culminating in the disinheritance of the nations at Babel in Genesis 11 and Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 through 9, God initiated a singular text-immanent strategy to reclaim his fractured creation. This restorative plan began with the election of Abraham in Genesis 12 verses 1 through 3, who was tasked with mediating divine blessing to the world. Genesis 22 operates as a profound narrative hinge within this framework. Having miraculously provided Isaac, the unique son of promise, Yahweh tests Abraham's allegiance to the covenant. The passage vividly demonstrates that the promise plan relies entirely upon the faithful provision of God, anchoring the theological worldview that divine blessing, substitutionary atonement, and the ultimate restoration of sacred space are achieved solely through God's appointed means. Exegesis of Genesis 22, A. The divine test in the unique Son, verses 1 through 2. The narrative explicitly opens by stating that God tested Abraham, establishing the framework that this event is a probationary trial rather than a capricious demand. God commands Abraham to take his son, explicitly identified as your only son whom you love, to the region of Moriah. The Greek Septuagint translates this unique status with the word monogenes, meaning only begotten or unique, highlighting that Isaac is the miraculous child of promise through whom the covenant must continue. This command intentionally echoes God's initial call in Genesis 12. Abraham is again told to go to a land God will show him, creating a literary and theological bracket around his journey of faith. B. Abraham's resurrection hope, verses 3 through 8. Abraham's obedience is immediate, demonstrating a matured faith cultivated through prior divine encounters. When leaving his servants, Abraham states, "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." This indicates Abraham's profound conviction that God's covenantal promises regarding Isaac were irrevocable. If God required Isaac's death, God was simultaneously capable of resurrecting him to fulfill the promise plan. In response to Isaac's inquiry about the sacrificial animal, Abraham prophetically declares, God will provide for himself the lamb, pointing forward to Yahweh's sovereign intervention. See the Akedah and the substitute, verses 9 through 14. The physical binding of Isaac, the Akedah, represents the climax of the narrative. Second Temple and later rabbinic traditions highly emphasize Isaac's age and willing participation, suggesting he voluntarily submitted to the binding. At the precipice of the sacrifice, the Angel of Yahweh intervenes, confirming Abraham's fear of God. A ram caught in the thicket is offered in Isaac's place, establishing the crucial biblical theological paradigm of substitution. Abraham names the place Yahweh-Yireh, meaning the Lord will provide. This solidifies the location of Mount Moriah as the future site of the Solomonic temple and the geographic center of substitutionary cultic worship. D. The oath and universal blessing, verses 15 through 18. Because of Abraham's obedience, the angel of the Lord issues a unilateral oath, swearing by himself. The covenant is robustly reaffirmed with two primary promises: the multiplication of Abraham's physical seed, like the stars and the sand, and the declaration that in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. This oath permanently weds the universal reclamation of the disinherited nations to the physical lineage of Isaac, preserving the concrete role of ethnic Israel within the cosmic scope of the Promise Plan. New Testament appropriations. The apostolic writers recognize the Akedah not merely as a moral exemplar, but as a prophetic typology deeply organically woven into the fabric of God's redemptive promise plan, finding its ultimate resonance in the cross of Christ. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, the author explicitly grounds Abraham's obedience in resurrection theology, noting that Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, and figuratively received Isaac back as a parable or type of the resurrected Messiah. In Romans chapter 8, verse 32, the Apostle Paul draws a direct linguistic and theological parallel to Genesis 22, stating that God the Father did not spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, contrasting the sparing of Isaac with the unspared sacrifice of Yeshua. James chapter 2, verse 21 unites Genesis 15, verse 6 and Genesis 22, arguing that Abraham's foundational faith was historically vindicated and brought to completion through his obedient works on Mount Moriah. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul traces the singular noun seed from the Abrahamic promises directly to the Messiah, demonstrating that the universal blessing promised in Genesis 22, verse 18 is enacted through Christ, the ultimate offspring of Abraham. Theological synthesis. Read through the lens of Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan Theology. Genesis 22 stands as a monumental pillar demonstrating the organic unity of Scripture. The text refuses to be siloed into a disconnected dispensation. Rather, it actively advances God's singular redemptive agenda to reclaim a fallen cosmos and disinherited nations. By demanding the Son of Promise, Yahweh tests the very mechanism of his covenant, ultimately revealing that the burden of redemption rests upon divine provision rather than human effort. The physical historical reality of Isaac's binding on Mount Moriah retains its concrete significance for the nation of Israel, serving as the foundational logic for the Levitical sacrificial system, while simultaneously pointing forward to its cosmic fulfillment. The Akedah prefigures the ultimate substitutionary atonement where God, taking on the role of both Abraham and the Ram, provides his unique Son to decisively defeat the powers of rebellion and extend the Edenic blessing to all families of the earth.